I'm doing this teardown for research purposes on another video I'm working on related to 8mm film. I didn't want to include the entire teardown in that video, so I decided to make a separate one that I hope can be useful to the Brownie 500 projector community, especially since my own searches for teardown videos of this product came up with nothing. Keep watching if you want to see possibly the first teardown video of this product next. In the past, I've taken apart small sections of this projector to get familiar with how things work. I'm surprised how simple some of the engineering was for things like the film feed mechanism and the projection system. Very simple ideas that produced quality results for the time it was created for. I'm also impressed with the durability of this projector, having been built in the mid-50s, yet still able to play back movies like it was brand new. I couldn't tell if any parts were replaced or are original, but I wonder if Kodak had a parts catalog for this product. That would be interesting to see. The reason I'm having to tear down this projector is to get a better view of how some parts are assembled and if they can be modified. I won't give a lot of details on what I'm doing, but do watch that upcoming video if you're interested in 8mm projectors. If what I want to do is possible, I think it could be a very popular modification for 8mm projector hobbyists, especially fans of this specific projector. Dismantling the shell is very easy on this projector. It's just a matter of removing every crosspoint screw you see, about 12 of them, with 4 of them buried inside the feet. Once the screws are removed, the shell pieces come off pretty easily. A lot of them look similar, so I've marked the inside so I'll know which is the top versus bottom pieces. One thing I like that's nice about these old products is that everything is spaced apart a lot to make it easier to work on by hand. Miniaturization has changed that today, where we need a microscope to see what we're working on, along with what are sometimes some very unique tools. Even though disassembly is easy to do, there are still parts that need to go back together in a specific order, and the screws are not all the same size. What I like to do is write sequential numbers on tape to label the parts as they're removed. If there are screws holding the part in place, those are taped to that specific part. The numbers will help me remember the reverse sequential order to follow for reassembly of everything, and that usually makes reassembly a lot easier. I'm displaying labels on screen to give you an idea of the possible part I'm working on, but don't depend on those names to be technically correct. If you Google them, you may not find what you're looking for. I'm just using a name depending on what the part seems like it's for. As mentioned earlier, I could not find any guide to help me with this disassembly. So far, parts have been easy to remove where no physical force was needed to remove the part. As I remove more and more of these parts though, the remaining parts are starting to look like the kind that need prying. That's where it gets tricky, because without information available on disassembly, I don't know for sure if these parts should be pried off. Besides the 2 screws to the right of the projection control box I'm working on, this will be the last of the easily removable parts. I'm not including the 2 screws to the right because that's about all that can be removed for that part. I'll remove whatever I'm able to from here, which won't be everything due to the through shaft behind one of the knobs. There is a small piece that seems to act as a glide for the film edge to slide across during playback. I removed that since it's able to fall out. For the lenses, there's just a stationary lens mounted inside of a frame that also guides the film during playback. The 2 screws removed is all that held that in place. The compartment holding the focusing lens in place can be slid backwards and outward for removal. Be careful here because some of the pieces inside the compartment can fall out. I've labeled and bagged all of these parts separately to both protect them from damage as well as to keep them organized and all together. If I do figure out how to easily remove any of the remaining pieces from the projection control box, I'll add them to this bag. Looking at the control box, there are 2 screws that look like if removed, then the entire control box can be removed, but that's not the case. The lighter colored knob is used to advance the film by hand, and it's mounted on a shaft that goes through the projector and is actually a part of the entire system that feeds the film. Because I haven't figured out how to remove any of the through shafts yet, those parts are pending research before I can remove them. From this point forward, it'll be a lot of research and experimenting with the proper way to remove the rest of the parts without damaging them. With some tinkering, I did come to find a few more parts that are removable from the control box. I'll remove them and probably keep them in a separate bag within the control box bag. These parts will be reinstalled first during reassembly of the control box. Sometime later, I found this lens was easy to remove, having only a clip holding it in place. It was a couple of days before I finally figured out how to remove the spindles. The take-up reel spindle could slide out when pushing on its tip from the pulley side. I was hesitant to put too much pressure on the plastic pulley, not knowing if it's fragile. One thing I forgot to do before removing the take-up reel spindle was to make note of the direction some of the pieces were facing before removing them. These shots should help when I reassemble the next spindle, which is the supply reel spindle. The supply reel spindle was a little different because you can't push this spindle through because of a C-clip at the other end of the spindle. At the time, I didn't realize the C-clip was there and might have gotten the spring off by pushing the spindle end so hard that the case might have flexed. If it did, it would have been a small flex because the spring only moved about 1/8 of an inch and I used a plier and my fingernail to get it the rest of the way off. I'm hoping the case didn't bend. C-clips can usually be removed by pushing down on its two ends. Because this one doesn't wrap around enough to push on them with something flat, I used the scissors. In looking back, what I needed to do first for the supply reel spindle was to remove the C-clip. Had I known to start with that, the supply reel spindle would have came out just as easily as the take-up reel spindle. Having some experience with removing spindles on this projector, I took a careful look at the film feeder spindle, and after removing the two screws holding the shiny protective cover, the only other fastener seemed to be a 1/4-inch bolt on the opposite side. After removing it using the 1/4-inch drive of my screwdriver, I could feel the spindle was very loose and could be removed easily. I checked to make sure no parts would fall off unexpectedly before sliding it out from the projector shell. Finally, getting back to parts that are not a struggle to remove. And can't forget the bushing. At this point, I thought I'd get some stills and short videos of the current layout of the remaining parts on the projector, just in case I might need them as a reference later. In looking over the remaining parts, there are a couple of areas I thought looked like the next logical steps for removal. Something else I noticed was the antiquated look of the electrical wires. Some of them do look aged, and I'm worried the plastic housing is so old it could crack. I'll look over them more closely once everything is disassembled. The next easiest part to remove is what I think is a large heat shield. Not sure if that's what it is, but it sits between the bulb and the case. Using these two wrenches, I can loosen the sleeve nut that I'm actually not sure what it's for. The spindle goes through it, but this isn't a compression nut, so it's got me scratching my head. Once loosened, I'll leave it on the spindle since there's no way to remove it yet. I had fiddled with this set screw for a while and it was really tight. I didn't want to force it because if stripped, that could be the end of this projector. I used WD-40 to help unlock the threads, cleaned up the dripping oil so it wouldn't get everywhere, then proceeded to get the Allen key in place and use a plier to turn it. That seemed to do the trick and the set screw was finally loose. With the spindle having loosened up a little, I was now able to get my slim open end wrench under the knob and pry it off, then remove the bearing plate just under it. With the knob removed, I was now able to slide the spindle out the opposite direction towards the gear and pulley side of the case. This is a reenactment of removing the control box, but for a while I couldn't figure out how to remove it. I eventually found that by preventing movement of the little metal square that can be seen through the hole in the control box, and at the same time rotating the control box counterclockwise to unlatch it, it can easily lift off. The rest of this clip is for reference to get on video the order of disassembly of the frame advanced bearing components. Again, this is so I know this video has a clip of the complete disassembly of this projector, so I can view it in reverse to help me with reassembly. Removing these two screws nearest to the camera frees up a fan spindle shield. I'm also removing all external screws because there aren't that many parts left to unfasten. I checked on this earlier and all the screws look like they're all holding the motor in place. I'll also undo the cord from the clip to give more slack to the motor it's connected to. Removing this hairpin clip frees up the pivot spindle for the electric motor. I can now remove the pivot spindle from the opposite side, pulling it out using a plier. The set screw holding the fan blade to the spindle can be loosened with an Allen key. I may have to pivot the motor so when removed, the fan blades can make it past the cutouts in the case. The motor support bracket can now come off. Use a socket to remove the upper outward facing nut. Mine seemed to be loose, so all I needed was the socket. The nut should slide right out from the opposite side. Now, carefully flipping the motor onto its side and being careful not to pull on the wires connected to it gives you access to the other nut to remove. The bolt holding the bracket in place should slide out easily. With a little wiggling of the motor, the pivot bracket should detach from the motor pretty easily. I'm at a point now where all the remaining parts can only be removed if I desolder the wires that are attached. Something I want to add when reassembling the soldered connections are connectors that can be pressed together. They'd have to be soldered on, but future teardowns and reassemblies would be a lot easier if I can simply pull off or press on the wired connections. I'll have to research what I can use, but this would be a nice modification. I'll start by removing the power cable. The lighting and space to work is very limited, so I'll try to be aware of my hands blocking the shot, but I may get into situations where that'll be unavoidable. Depending on how desoldering works out, I'll try to stick with using the solder sucker, but if needed, I'll switch to the solder wick. The wick is a lot easier to work with, but I try to avoid using it because it's a consumable product and I don't have much of it. I initially thought I could heat the wire till the solder melts, then pull the wire off from the connection. After using the solder wick to absorb the solder holding the wire to the connector, I realized the wires are snagged into the connector, so even without solder, the wires won't disconnect easily. I eventually cut the wires off close to the connector and will clean up the connector once I get the parts out of the case. Now that the power cord and close by wires have been removed, this also means any wires holding the motor inside the case are also disconnected. I removed the tape I had used to secure the motor to the case and could easily take it out without any interference from wires. The spindle for the frame advance is loose but can't come out because a shield inside the case prevents it from being removed. The shield is attached to the spindle with a nut. I used a screwdriver through a nearby hole in the case to keep the shield from turning, allowing me to loosen the nut, remove the shield, then remove the spindle. I'm removing the light bulb socket next, but because it's still connected to the toggle switch that turns it on, I'm going to leave them connected and remove both together as a unit. I'll start with the switch, which is just a matter of unscrewing this nut outside the case, then the switch should fall into the case. From what I can see, it looks like to remove the socket, I just need to unscrew these two screws and the socket will be loose with the wiring and switch connected. I'll then need to fish it out because the socket and switch are in different compartments within the case. I'll go about fishing the socket and switch out from the compartments therein, being careful not to slide the wire across any of the sharp edges of the metal case. It's kinda tricky because it's difficult to see what something might be caught on when it's stuck, so I try to take my time and not pull too hard to get the parts out. To make room for when I bag these parts for temporary storage, I'm removing the wires from the socket. They're only held in place by screws, so they're easily removed. The next part that should be easy to remove is the film playback knob. From inside the case, I'm using a small flathead screwdriver tip that fits in the opening of the C-clip. All I need to do is twist the screwdriver and it'll pry the C-clip from the shaft it's pressed onto. It's not shown in this clip, but that metal circle comes off next and it does slip off easily from the shaft. These are the parts in the order they should be reassembled. In order from right to left, it would be the knob, washer, insert the shaft through the case, big metal circle, then C-clip. The final part to remove, and I'll finally be done tearing down this projector, is this sliding on-off toggle switch. To get started, the slider has to be in the off position or slid away from the edge of the case. In that position, it frees up a thin retainer clip holding the slider to the case from inside the case. To remove it, push its outward edge so it protrudes from the case, allowing you to grab hold of its edge and pull it out. It pulls out very easily, so you shouldn't need any tools to do this. With the retainer clip removed, the slider can also be removed by sliding it about halfway between its on-off position. Two handles holding the slider to the case will line up with cutouts, and it can then be pulled away from the case. Like the toggle switch for the bulb, unscrew the nut securing the switch to the case. This is the only thing holding it in place, so once removed, the switch can be pulled out from inside the case. Be aware that as soon as the switch is removed from inside the case, the decorative side panel outside the case will now be loose, so keep an eye on that as well, especially if you're working at the edge of a table. I was working on the floor, so mine fell to my leg and the carpet. I'm glad I was able to create this video to possibly help a small audience of Brownie 500 projector owners that may want to tear down, refurbish, or just tinker with the internals of this projector. I was also very impressed with the durability of some of the parts used in this projector. Some plastic, lots of metal, but what surprised me were belts made of metal springs. In thinking it through, that was pretty genius because if the belt ever stretches out over time, just cut the springs shorter and reconnect the ends, something not easily done with rubber belts of today. As I mentioned in this video, this teardown is a result of another video I'm working on. Now that I've gained access to all the internal parts, it'll help me understand how everything works and how the parts important to me are affected by other parts. With that knowledge, I feel a lot more comfortable with moving forward on the other project. It still won't be easy, but being informed is a useful resource. This was a scary project because I was really impressed by the beautiful condition of the projector and how pristine it was kept for more than 50 years. The potential to damage something was always on my mind throughout this teardown. It's a relief to have reached the end goal of this phase of the overall project. I'm hoping this video makes its way to the appropriate people who would like to learn a little more about their Kodak Brownie 500 projector. Leave your questions and comments in the comment section below. That's all I have for now, and I'll catch you in the next video.